No class that introduces you to the study of rhetoric would be complete without talking about classical rhetoric. Your book talks about different periods of rhetoric, and you need to know those. But I'm going to go back to classic rhetoric because so much a sort of fundamental thinking about rhetoric really occurs in that period. And honestly, in the classic period, there's a lot of thought and talk, and the remains actually, the writings in that period about rhetoric. But it fades and changes a lot over about 2,000 years. Really, I mean, there's lots of other things, the Belles Lettres period and so forth, but it's not as close to rhetoric as what we study now in many ways as it is in the classic period. So we always go back to classical rhetoric. Right? And it's the roots of the study of speech. This is what we're looking at. And I should clarify that really this is the roots of the study of speech in Western culture. I'm going back to ancient Greece, and with that really as well, to some degree to ancient Rome. Around the world, other cultures are also studying speech, but not in the same way, not with as many texts surviving, and certainly none of them having the same influence on contemporary U.S. culture. We do get, for instance, out of Africa, older than anything we're talking about here are things like the Maxims of Tehotep, which talks about how to speak to those in power. In Eastern cultures, there are books and rules about how one addresses the emperor and such, but the study of argument would seem to have been a greater focus, really, of the Western classic sort of Greek and Roman history. Right. So classical rhetoric, what I'm going to talk about here, I'm going to define classical rhetoric, what it is that we're talking about as classical rhetoric, talk about the three types of public speaking, and this is the three types of public speaking that comes out of classical rhetoric, and we see traces of today as well, and how we talk about it here in dominant Western culture. There are who I call the good old boys of Western rhetoric, and I'll talk a little bit about why I call them that. We're going to talk about the sophists, who are hugely important as well. So, all right, so we have defining classical rhetoric. So this goes back to about 400 BCE or so. If you're not familiar with BCE, that means before contemporary era. That's the substitution for BC, which of course is before Christ, which doesn't work for all people. All right. So we're talking about here is really pretty much the Greeks back to about 400 BCE, somewhere in there. Much of this occurring in Athens and Rome. Just so you know where I'm talking about this one place, right? They had the most profound effect on the culture that we have today here in the States and in much of Western culture. The largest number of texts, it would seem, that were written about speech and about argument seem to have been from this place. It seems to be the heart of it as well. Right? And so the Greeks, really, for the most part, they talk about the three types of public speaking. Now we could, slice this up in many different ways. How many types of public speaking are there? But they identified three types of public speaking. Today, as we teach public speaking, as we teach argumentation, debate, we follow the same pattern. Now, perhaps there's some other pattern from another culture that we might be inspired by, and we could slice this up some different ways. Maybe we should talk about 5 types of speech or 4. But by and large, we still talk about 3 types of speech about 2,500 years later. So, again, classic rhetoric, that is, classic Greco, yes, or Greek rhetoric, really has a strong influence on us today here in the States. Right? So the first type of rhetoric was called forensic, right? Forensic, and so you do think some about like forensics, like the speech and debate team is forensic. Also, when you hear forensics, you probably think about like CSI sort of stuff, right? Like dental forensics is a study of the teeth of dead people, right? Usually to identify bodies. But yeah, so forensic medicine has to do usually with determining death, is what coroners do. But also there's like forensic accounting, right? Which is, it's all about going back and figuring out what has happened. And so it's determining truth, right? So forensic speech is about determining truth. What did happen, what didn't happen, right? And so when you think about forensic medicine, right, and so the study of death, what happened that they died, right? What is the and by the coroners determine the sort of truth of death, ruling it a homicide, ruling it a suicide, ruling it natural cause, right? They determine the truth of death. So it's forensic argument is about determining truth. And this takes place really largely, it's the rhetoric of the courtroom. If you think about what happens in court, they're determining truth. They're determining what has happened. And that's what a trial does. Actually, I was watching this years ago, an interview with Justice Stephen Breyer, and he said, a jury establishes truth. That's what they do. They establish what is the truth. He said, because when it comes to us on appeal, we don't question the truth. We question how they got to that truth, right? But he said, we don't question, right? But the jury establishes the truth, right? So what did happen? Did the person steal it? Did they not steal it? Did the person do something that makes them to blame for the slip and fall, right? That's forensic rhetoric. That's all about determining truth. It's the rhetoric of the courtroom. Then we get deliberative rhetoric, right? So deliberative, right, like deliberate, it's about making a decision. Obviously, a decision about truth is a decision as well, but making a decision, and it means about how we should proceed, right? So this is policy. This is policy. So when you're doing argumentation, debate, and we have, I don't know if you had policy speeches or policy debates, but about why certain actions should be taken. If you gave a persuasive speech as opposed to speech to convince, which would be about fact, to believe that something is true, but one to speech to motivate. We say like Monroe's motivated sequence, if you studied that, right? But to motivate, it's to get people to do something, and that's what deliberative rhetoric is about, getting people to do something. It's about policy, right? Policy are about decisions to do things. And so where do we have arguments about where we should do things? Well, that's the legislature, right? Legislatures we broadly think of as being where there are arguments about what should we do, what laws should we have, what should people be required to do, what should people not be allowed to do. That's deliberative rhetoric, and that's the rhetoric of the legislature. And then we get this last one, and this is epideictic, right? So epideictic, if you're trying to get that pronunciation, right? So epi makes not like needles, right? Epi, and it's deictic, right? So epideictic is the ceremonial rhetoric. Epideictic rhetoric is that of what we call praise and blame. So you think about the speeches that you learn about. Let's see, we learn to argue for something is true, and we learn to argue that we should do something. And then you also learn speeches that are, I guess, and I realize I don't know quite what we put in formative speeches. They usually are somewhere around forensic or deliberative. But these are those other speeches, what you might have learned about as being speeches of special occasion, where we talk about praise and blame. So you learn eulogies, right? A eulogy that we take a moment to say, here's this person, and hear what was good about them, right? It's a speech of praise. At graduations, it's a ceremonial speech, and a speech is given to tell you what it is you should excel for, and it is praising certain virtues. It is praising certain values. So ceremonial rhetoric is the rhetoric of praise and blame, and in that it's not about necessarily praising a person or blaming a person, though it could be. It's celebrating, right? Emphasizing, celebrating, or denigrating certain values, right? Certain ways of being. Right? You think about at a toast given at a wedding, that's a celebration of love. It's a praise of love, right? We don't really think about, I mean, it is sort of technically praise and blame. I don't think we give a lot of speeches of blame. That'd be a really rough funeral. That SOB. I mean, that's a, uh, it's a tough funeral, tough room. That's what mine will be like. Anyway, so that's epideictic. So we get the ceremonial, and you think about when somebody takes the oath of office and then they give a speech. They may do some sort of indication of policy, but they likely spend a lot of time. Well, they used to. There's been some change in this sort of historically over time, but people used to talk about the greatness of democracy, the importance of the people. This is very common elements, even still actually in most presidential, I want to say acceptance speeches, not acceptance speeches, but in there, they take the oath of office, They give their inaugural address. Goodness, I couldn't think of that. All right. So those are the 3 types of public speaking. So we get to the good old boys. And so when I say the good old boys, I do think a little bit of, Dukes of Hazzard. Just the good old boys, right? Driving around in their General Lee with the Confederate flag on it. So yeah, that's problematic. And also calling these guys the good old boys, it is sort of problematic in a way that I want to illuminate. So as we're talking about the major figures of classic rhetoric, we largely have focused on the men. And of course, in ancient Rome, these were all free men. They were not slaves. They were landowners. They were, I don't want to say 1%ers, right? But they were, yeah, they were of the class of privilege. And so it was largely men. There were women writing some. There were, like Hypatia, for instance, were at and Sappho as well, were very much writing, but they struggled in society in different ways, to be recognized, to be taken seriously, to be seen as being a little more than concubines to men, even. So, yeah, it really was about sort of an old boys club of these free men, right? Land owning of privilege. That's who these were. So we get a lot of influence and impact there. It's a problem we get. So, for instance, even if you think about much of the depictions we see of life and sexuality, of sexual being, of course, part of life, in ancient Greek culture, it largely focuses around the things that men are doing, and even when it comes to sex, about men's pleasure, right? So a strong emphasis there. So just putting it out there, part of this calling the good old boys, a little bit of a ha-ha, but also it's to point out that, yeah, there was sort of this exclusive boys club that went on in classic Greece. Boy, so glad that's over. It's not. Okay. So that's spa, and you'll see that the good old boys are spas. First one, it's Socrates. Good old Socrates. And so I'm sure in school you read the writings of Socrates. No, you didn't. He didn't write anything, right? No, Socrates believed in an absolute truth. That's a capital T truth, that there is an absolute truth to all things. And so it's not about, well, you see what they did as being an act of heroism. Frankly, I think what they did makes them a coward. Mm-mm. No, they either are a hero or they are a coward. There is a singular answer, and we got to get at it. This belief in an absolute truth, the belief that all things have what is called an ultimate form or a perfected state. I mean, there is like the perfect form for a chair, sort of thing. But yeah, he very much believed in an absolute truth, and that was something that rhetoric was for, right? Rhetoric was to help us determine absolute truth. So this is Socrates' part of philosophy and rhetoric, that we're using argument to determine truth. So Plato is Socrates' student. And the reason that you never wrote anything or read anything that Socrates wrote is because Socrates didn't write anything. Everything that Socrates said we know of because of Plato. Right, and this be pointed out, right? Because of Plato. Plato wrote down things that Socrates said, and so we call them the Socratic dialogues. And that was Socrates engaging in arguments with people like Gorgias, who will come up later, like Phaedrus. And Plato wrote those down, and so that's how we know how much we know, or what we know really of Socrates' philosophy and beliefs about the world and rhetoric, comes from his student Plato, because Socrates didn't write anything down. Part of it was, if you, my God, you let him write it down, you'll never remember anything, right? And so I always say, think about all the phone numbers in your phone, and how many of them do you remember, right? Once it's programmed in, you don't have to know it anymore. I think the number I still know best is the number of my childhood, my grandparents' phone numbers, right? When I used to have to, actually, no, wrong way. Okay, it doesn't matter. So Plato was Socrates' student. So teacher, student, Socrates, Plato. Like I say, he wrote those Socratic dialogues, right? That's how you spell that, right? Socratic. So he wrote the Socratic dialogues, and he was slightly more liberal in his thinking than Socrates, slightly so, right? But largely, he did believe in an absolute truth, only slightly more liberal than him, especially when it comes to issues of politics. A little bit more liberal than Socrates was in views of politics, thinking that maybe you can trust people, possibly, but probably not, whereas Socrates really didn't think you could. Aristotle wrote a book called Rhetoric, or On Rhetoric, or The Rhetoric, depending upon how it's translated. I think the copy I read was called On Rhetoric, translated by George Alexander, as I recall. Just throwing that out there for you, right? So yeah, the guy literally wrote the book On Rhetoric. And some of this was him pulling together what had been written by other people. So it's not all of it was his new writings, but I mean, it's really sort of a fascinating read. He talks about the nature of friends, the nature of enemies. How do you talk differently to a friend than you do to an enemy? I mean, he's very, recognizing that speech varies according to the situation and the person. And that's pretty important, that our speech will vary according to the situation of the person, because this starts moving away from there's an absolute truth to, well, I mean, how we approach talking about something is probably going to vary according to who we're talking to, right? And he talks about age. Oh, so here's this quick gem I'll give you. This is a freebie for you. He says that, talking about the difference of the young and the old, he says the problem of the young is they have too much courage and too little wisdom, right? Make bad choices, right? You're being young, but I think about in your teens, that you're just, you're brave enough to try anything, but not enough wisdom to know you shouldn't try it. He says the problem of the old, which would be like 40, although there's some, not entirely during this period, but the problem of the old, though, is that they have too much wisdom, right? They always know it can go wrong. Too much wisdom, and therefore too little courage, right? So they don't do, because they're so afraid of what could happen, they don't do anything. It says what you always want are the golden years, which by the way is a wonderful David Bowie song. Whoop whoop whoop. Golden years. That's when you had this right balance of courage and wisdom. Isn't that fantastic? Always thought about that. I've always thought about that. Anyway, so he wrote Rhetoric, and he has a definition of rhetoric that I want you to know as his definition of rhetoric. Right? And this will go back to when I asked you all, how do you define persuasion, or persuasion, how do you define rhetoric, how do you think of it? Many of you said persuasion. That was good. That was perfectly fine. He says rhetoric is identifying all available means of persuasion in a given situation. Right? Identifying all available means of persuasion in a given situation. So the example I always use is, if you're trying to convince somebody to quit smoking, and they are 16 versus they are 60, you're probably going to have to rely upon different arguments, right? A person who's 16 may have a hard time, we talked about this, too much courage, too little wisdom, imagining being old, not feeling good. When you're 16, oh my gosh, please, 2 hours of sleep, you're ready to go, if that, you know what I mean? So it's hard to use those arguments about slowing your body down, not feeling as good, not living as long. When you're 16, I mean, those arguments are not as efficacious as we'd say, right? You're not going to get as far as quickly with them. But a 16-year-old may be more prone to arguments about the way it's going to affect your social desirability, right? How much, just socially, not even sexually necessarily, but just socially, how desirable you are, how it can affect your social life. Things like when there are, not smoking allowed in places, you have to always go outside to smoke. I've heard a complaint from my students before, like, oh my gosh, you're hanging with your friends, but if you've got to smoke, right? You got to step outside. So you can see how that sort of argument means much more to a 16-year-old than to a 60-year-old, right? So all available means of persuasion in a given situation. Part of how this actually, again, being Aristotle being a little bit more liberal than Plato, Aristotle being Plato's student, there's a teacher-student pattern there, is that we're moving away from a belief in the real certainty of truth. I mean, not totally, but the idea that, well, what's true is true, but certain people in certain situations will accept other things as being true through one argument than another, right? There's not one good argument. There are multiple good arguments and multiple ways to get people to that belief. So that's where Aristotle gets us, the idea that each situation, each context, each audience provides us different opportunities, different ways to persuade. And so the study of rhetoric is understanding those situations, responding to it. So we're getting here, hugely important, that the context of rhetoric matters. Right? the context of rhetoric matters. And I give you this question to ponder. Think of a film that you saw that you just thought was a great film because it made you laugh, it made you cry, it inspired you, whatever it was, whatever it is. Do you think that same film, context aside of like, space travel and, being shown in the 1930s isn't going to compute quite so much if it's like, space travel, say in the, 2000s. But do you think that film would necessarily be received the same way in a different decade? Do you think it's gonna right? I mean, and listen, I love some old movies. I mean, there's like some like It Hot, which is Marilyn Monroe movie. It's several decades old, right? That's hysterical. There's some stuff from the 30s that I really enjoy watching, but they're made differently in a certain sort of aesthetic. The question is, that movie you're thinking of that you love, and maybe that is an old movie, I don't know, but do you think that it always speaks to each audience the same way? Probably not. Probably why it's funny or the things that are used as humor shift and change with time. By the way, I'll give you the most cringeworthy that didn't age well line I've seen in a movie would be in the original movie version of The Women, which stars Norma Shearer, who's fabulous, along with actually a full cast of just women. Actually, women are only ever seen on screen, and she's newly divorced, and she tells her mother, "Oh, mother, I was going to get in bed and spread out like a swastika." I think, ooh, that did not age well. All right. But so rhetoric is all available means of persuasion in a given situation. So that context, that audience is crucial and key. So there's that. Right. And one of the things that Aristotle also does for us is he outlines then this use of emotion, logic, and credibility, which we'll come back to as we discuss more of the intricacies of chapter 2. But he does outline the use of emotion, logic, and credibility. And that's rather important to our beginning of our study of rhetoric.